It begins not with a grand discovery, but with a question. What if the past isn't what we think it is? What if the story of human progress is missing chapters? Chapters written in forgotten languages, carved into stone, buried beneath the ocean, or collecting dust in museum archives. For generations, we've told ourselves a story of advancement, that we, the modern inheritors of centuries of progress, stand at the peak of human understanding. But what if we've been wrong? In the early 20th century, a corroded bronze device, pulled from the seabed off the coast of Greece, was dismissed as little more than a curiosity. It sat in museums, its gears locked in place, its surfaces scarred by centuries underwater. And then, as technology advanced, we began to see it more clearly. We began to read what was once unreadable. What emerged was not myth or poetry, but mathematics, engineering, astronomical data, predictive cycles of lunar eclipses and planetary positions, recorded with a level of precision that, according to our own timelines, shouldn't have existed for another 1,500 years. This was the first crack. The first clue that the story of history as we knew it might need to be rewritten, but it wouldn't be the last. From buried cities to forgotten scripts, from trade ledgers carved in clay to engineering manuals written in ink and reed, ancient texts have surfaced one by one, each whispering the same quiet revelation. They knew more than we thought. Time and again, modern theories about ancient limitations have collapsed beneath the weight of direct evidence. Bronze Age tablets reveal global trade networks thousands of years old. Medical papyri describe surgical procedures so precise they still echo in modern textbooks. Babylonian tablets lay out astronomical calculations using methods that resemble calculus. Polynesian navigation texts map star routes across open ocean without a single compass. These aren't anomalies, they're patterns. Each text tells a different story, but together they form a chorus. And that chorus sings a truth we've too long ignored. Ancient civilizations weren't simply fumbling in the dark until modernity rescued them. They were building, calculating, healing, observing. They were scientists, engineers, philosophers. They were us. And yet, with each new revelation, we hesitate. We question the translations, doubt the interpretations, and cling to our narratives. Maybe it's because to admit the truth would mean more than rewriting textbooks. It would mean confronting our own intellectual arrogance, the belief that we are the culmination of all human achievement, that those who came before were mere preludes to us. But history doesn't climb in a straight line. It twists, it forgets, it loses knowledge, and finds it again centuries later. Sometimes it buries brilliance beneath sand and sea, and sometimes the only way to see the full picture is to start over. This series is not about proving conspiracies or glorifying the past. It's about listening, about examining the evidence with humility and curiosity, about following where the texts lead us, even if that path leads to uncomfortable truths. Across the next 13 chapters, we'll travel through ancient ports and forgotten languages, through the halls of early hospitals and the minds of long-dead mathematicians. Each part focuses on a single discovery, a text that changed everything. We'll see how these documents challenged what we thought we knew and what they reveal about the people who created them. Because behind every tablet, scroll, or inscription is a human mind, a person who observed the world and tried to make sense of it. And perhaps in understanding them better, we begin to understand ourselves, not as the final chapter of history, but as one part in a much longer, much deeper story. So let's begin, not with answers, but with wonder, not with certainty, but with a question. What if the past was smarter than we thought? The waves crashed softly against the seabed as a group of sponge divers descended off the coast of Antikythera in 1900. Expecting to find sponges or perhaps a few sunken amphorae, they stumbled instead upon a wreck. Its timbers long decayed, but its cargo oddly preserved. Among statues and debris lay a corroded chunk of bronze covered in gears and encrusted with centuries of marine life. No one knew what it was. It would take decades and breakthroughs in imaging technology before the truth came to light. Hidden beneath the corrosion was a mechanical device unlike anything known from antiquity. Today, we call it the Antikythera mechanism, but it was something far more shocking, a mechanical computer built in ancient Greece over 2,000 years ago. It wasn't designed to tell time or simply display constellations. Its inscribed gears calculated the movements of celestial bodies. Lunar phases, solar cycles, eclipses. It predicted astronomical events with mathematical accuracy thought to be centuries out of reach for the ancient world. According to prevailing theories, the Greeks had no such technology. And yet, here it was. Even more stunning was the writing engraved across its surface. Fragmented and faint, the Greek text described how to operate the mechanism, which gears tracked which planets, how to set the dials to chart the positions of the sun, moon, and stars for a given date. It was not metaphorical or mythical. It was technical. Clear instructions meant for users familiar with advanced astronomy. Modern scholars had long assumed the ancient Greeks observed the heavens with basic models and conceptual diagrams, that they lacked the tools to make predictions beyond rough approximations. The Antikythera text demolished that assumption. It referenced the Metonic cycle, a 19-year pattern of lunar phases, and the Saros cycle, used for predicting eclipses. It even described the moon's elliptical orbit and irregular motion, modeled with an epicyclic gear system. These ideas wouldn't appear again in scientific literature until the Renaissance. And yet here they were, documented in bronze and ink before the birth of Christ. The most disquieting part? The device was not unique. The inscriptions referred to it as a standard model, implying that other such machines existed, possibly many, but no others have yet been found. This wasn't a one-time miracle, it was the product of a tradition we lost. When the text was first translated, academics resisted. They argued that the writing must have been theoretical, not reflective of real working devices, that it borrowed from later knowledge or misrepresented simpler tools. But as more of the inscriptions were decoded and the gear ratios confirmed against known celestial cycles, those objections fell apart. It became clear the creators of the mechanism understood advanced mathematics, observational astronomy, and mechanical engineering. They weren't guessing. They were calculating, building machines to represent the heavens. And then came the inevitable question: what else did they know that we've forgotten? If one device survived at the bottom of the sea, how many others were lost, and how much knowledge sank with them? The Antikythera mechanism forces us to reconsider the timeline of technological evolution. It shows that knowledge can appear, thrive, and vanish, forgotten not because it was impossible, but because history is fragile. War, disaster, neglect. Any of these can erase centuries of progress. What remains is this rusted artifact and the quiet genius of its creators, who dared to build a machine that modeled the universe. They left us a message not in myth or legend, but in gear ratios and predictive cycles. And in doing so, they challenged the most persistent myth of all, that we are the first to understand the world so well. The heat of the sun shimmered across the ruins of a long-forgotten port city when archaeologists began to dig in the 1970s. Beneath layers of dust and time, they unearthed something unexpected. Not gold or statues, but clay tablets, thousands of them, each etched with tightly packed lines of script. At first, they seemed mundane: shipping records, cargo manifests, receipts. But when linguists began translating them, the ordinary became extraordinary. These weren't records from a small local market. They were documentation of a vast and sophisticated international trade network operating over 3,500 years ago. The tablets recorded regular shipments between Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, and the islands of the Aegean. Copper, tin, textiles, wine, precious stones, and luxury items all moved between ports thousands of miles apart. Modern theories had long assumed Bronze Age societies were mostly self-sufficient, with trade limited to nearby regions. But these tablets told a different story, a story of commerce on a scale thought impossible until the Roman Empire, organized, multinational, and systematized. One tablet listed a single shipment of copper ingots, weighing several tons, accompanied by detailed logs of textiles, oils, and ceramics. Another recorded dozens of transactions from a single year, detailing letters of credit, partnership arrangements, and contracts across language and cultural barriers. These weren't isolated exchanges or random bartering sessions. They were part of a complex economic ecosystem. Merchants used standardized weights and measures. They relied on agents in foreign ports. They maintained professional records and wrote in multiple languages, blending dialects to serve as early commercial lingua francas. To modern economists and historians, this was staggering. Such coordination required not just practical know-how, but institutional knowledge, laws, contracts, logistics, finance. It suggested that Bronze Age societies were not scattered and insular, but deeply interconnected. At first, scholars hesitated. Maybe this site was exceptional. Maybe this city was uniquely advanced. But then, more archives surfaced at other sites, and the pattern repeated. Everywhere they looked, similar trade documents appeared, mapping a network that spanned continents. What's more, the tablets showed a level of multiculturalism that challenged another assumption, that ancient people lived in cultural silos. Here were documents that casually mixed languages, names, and customs. The people behind them were cosmopolitan, educated, and adaptive. They were not just traders, but diplomats, risk managers, and economic strategists. And perhaps most impressively, they planned for the future. They invested, they pooled resources, they tracked performance across years. In one document, a merchant outlined a 3-year investment cycle for importing tin from distant mines, complete with projected returns. These texts collapse the idea that complexity in trade only arose with modern finance. They show that principles of economics, supply chains, credit, diversification were already being practiced before the Iron Age even began. But they also raise a question that lingers like a shadow. If such a system existed then, what happened to it? Why was this level of organization lost for over 1,000 years? The answer, as always, is complex. War, environmental collapse, shifting power centers. The infrastructure of trade is fragile, even more so when held together by sailboats and clay tablets. Yet these records remain, baked in fire, hidden in ruins, as proof that the ancient world was not small or primitive. It was bold, connected, capable of managing an international system of exchange long before modern shipping lanes and container ports. In reading these tablets, we hear the voices of ancient accountants and shipping agents, not kings or poets, but the ordinary professionals who kept a vast machine running. Their story reminds us that complexity is not new, and that history, like trade itself, is never as linear as we imagine. In the dry light of a Cairo afternoon in the 19th century, a group of European scholars carefully unrolled a bundle of ancient papyri pulled from a forgotten tomb. They expected magic spells, religious hymns, or superstitious remedies. What they found instead was something far more unsettling: a medical textbook. Written over 3,000 years ago, the text offered not chants or charms, but diagnoses and treatments grounded in clinical observation. The scroll described symptoms that today's doctors would recognize instantly: concussions, heart disease, infections. And alongside those symptoms were treatments: surgical techniques, bandaging methods, antiseptics. Real medicine. This discovery overturned long-standing assumptions about ancient healthcare. For generations, scholars portrayed ancient medicine as a fog of mysticism and guesswork, only emerging into science with the Greeks and later the Renaissance. But these Egyptian texts told another story, of doctors as methodical, precise, and scientifically minded. One papyrus included more than 700 treatments. When modern researchers analyzed them, they were astonished to find that many of the substances described had real therapeutic effects. Some contained antibacterial compounds. Others mimicked modern antibiotics or anti-inflammatory agents. These weren't accidents. They were the result of centuries of experimentation, recorded and refined by generations of practitioners. Even more astonishing were the surgical texts. They included instructions for suturing wounds, treating skull fractures, and resetting broken bones. In one case, the scroll describes checking pupil dilation in head trauma patients, a neurological exam still taught in medical schools today. The Egyptians also understood the circulatory system. They wrote about the heart as a central organ and the pulse as a diagnostic tool. This wasn't poetic metaphor, it was medical insight. And it predated Western theories of circulation by over 1,000 years. What shocked historians wasn't just the accuracy of these texts, but their structure. The medical papyri were organized, systematic, and clearly intended for instruction. They spoke of specialized practitioners, doctors for eyes, for teeth, for internal diseases. There were references to training, to case discussion, to evaluation of treatments. It was evidence of a full-fledged medical education system. Yet, when these texts were first translated, many scholars tried to downplay them. They suggested the surgical sections were symbolic, that the effective remedies were accidental. Some even argued that the documents were theoretical, never truly applied in practice. But the evidence mounted, and so did the realization. This was real medicine, grounded in observation and logic, not mysticism. The Egyptians had hospitals, they had training programs, they knew how disease spread. One papyrus even mentioned isolating sick patients, an early understanding of contagion. Another instructed physicians to wash their hands and tools, centuries before antiseptic procedures became standard. This wasn't just advanced, it was ahead of its time. The texts challenged the belief that rational medicine began with Hippocrates. They showed that scientific healing had roots far older and deeper. And perhaps more importantly, they revealed how historical narratives can be skewed, not by evidence, but by assumptions about who counts as a real scientist. In the end, what these ancient scrolls offer isn't just a glimpse into early medical practice. They are a reminder that knowledge isn't bound to our timeline. It can rise, flourish, and then vanish, leaving us to rediscover what was already known. The hands that wrote those scrolls weren't fumbling in darkness. They were steady, practiced, and skilled, and their legacy lives on, in the pulse we feel, the sutures we stitch, the antiseptics we use. Medicine didn't begin with modern science. It began when someone looked at a wound and asked, "How can I help?" In a quiet corner of a museum in the South Pacific, a piece of driftwood sat for years, its surface carved with strange geometric lines and star-like symbols. It was labeled as an artifact of unknown significance until a Polynesian elder recognized it for what it was, a navigation manual. What followed was a revelation that rippled through the maritime world. The carvings weren't decorative. They were instructions, codified knowledge passed down through generations to tailor how to cross thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments, maps, or written charts. Just stars, swells, clouds, and memory. For centuries, Western scholars believed ancient oceanic travel was limited to coastal paddling or accidental voyages pushed off course by storms. But this wooden tablet told a different story. Ancient Polynesians, it seemed, were master navigators. They explored and settled nearly every island across the vast Pacific through deliberate, methodical journeys. The text described how to read ocean swells, those deep, rolling waves that travel for hundreds of miles from distant storms. Navigators would feel these swells through the motion of their canoes, detecting subtle changes in direction. They learned to distinguish local chop from far-traveled swells that reflected off distant islands, using them to find land beyond the horizon. Even more remarkably, the manual detailed star paths. Each island had a set of stars that rose or set directly overhead. By following these stars and tracking their movement across the sky, navigators could sail across thousands of miles and still arrive at a pinpoint destination. It was, in effect, celestial GPS, developed long before sextants or compasses. The knowledge wasn't casual. Young navigators trained for years, memorizing hundreds of star paths, the rhythm of swells, the flight patterns of seabirds, and even the color of the ocean near certain atolls. This wasn't folk magic. It was systematic science, passed through oral tradition with astonishing precision. When the carvings were first translated, many dismissed their practicality. How could a person feel wave patterns in a canoe? How could they possibly detect direction without tools? But then came the tests. In the late 20th century, traditional Polynesian canoes were reconstructed. Navigators trained in the old ways set out across the Pacific. No motors, no maps, no instruments. And they arrived, over and over again. From Hawaii to Tahiti, from Samoa to Easter Island. They sailed thousands of miles using nothing but ancient knowledge. The methods worked, not as myth, but as measurable reality. This discovery shattered long-standing assumptions about what ancient people were capable of. It showed that complex scientific understanding doesn't require written notation or formal education. It can be encoded in memory, embedded in training, and passed across generations through discipline and observation. It also challenged the narrative of technological progress as a straight upward climb. Polynesian navigators had no steel, no compasses, no written maps, but they had something else, an intimate understanding of their environment, refined by centuries of careful exploration. The tablet, the quiet piece of carved wood, wasn't just a relic. It was a manual for one of humanity's greatest achievements, the exploration and settlement of the largest ocean on Earth. And it forced scholars to admit something uncomfortable. That knowledge, even complex, testable knowledge, can exist outside the institutions and formats we recognize. That cultures dismissed as primitive often had systems of understanding that rivaled or surpassed our own. In the end, the navigation manual is more than a document. It is a testament to the quiet genius of people who trusted their senses, trained their minds, and read the sky like a map. Their discoveries are written not in books, but across the sea itself. In a quiet library in Berlin in 1881, a scholar gently unwrapped a set of Babylonian clay tablets that had been sitting in crates since their excavation. What he discovered, written in cuneiform, changed the course of astronomy. These weren't just records of observations. They were calculations, predictions of planetary positions centuries into the future. The tablets didn't merely describe the skies, they modeled them. According to the prevailing academic narrative, such predictive precision shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. Advanced mathematical astronomy was believed to have originated with the Greeks and only reached its peak during the Renaissance. But these tablets, dating back to the 4th century BCE, suggested otherwise. Laid out in rows and columns, the tablets track the movement of planets across the sky, using mathematical methods modern astronomers would later recognize as eerily similar to integral calculus. Babylonian scribes were calculating how fast planets moved at different points in their orbits and how their speed changed over time. They had, in effect, developed techniques to compute areas under curves, more than 2 millennia before Newton or Leibniz put it into formal terms. This was not just a leap in understanding. It was a direct challenge to the story that mathematical abstraction, especially calculus, was a uniquely European achievement. The more researchers studied the tablets, the more extraordinary their implications became. The Babylonians used geometric methods to visualize time and motion. They calculated planetary velocity. They used mathematical series and interpolation to improve predictions. The level of abstraction they achieved was stunning and systematic. These weren't scattered insights. The texts formed part of a continuous tradition, a school of astronomy and mathematics that passed knowledge from scribe to scribe, generation after generation. The techniques weren't guesswork or rote copying. They were tested, refined, and verified against actual celestial movements. At first, many academics refused to accept this. The mathematics seemed too advanced. Surely modern scholars were reading too much into the cuneiform. Maybe the calculations were just clever approximations without true understanding. Maybe the results were coincidental. But as additional tablets were translated and cross-verified, the denials crumbled. The accuracy of the predictions was too precise. The internal consistency of the mathematical models too deliberate. These ancient astronomers weren't just observing, they were theorizing. They were building a framework to understand the mechanics of the cosmos. Even more shocking was the realization that Greek astronomers, long credited with founding the discipline, were heavily influenced by their Babylonian predecessors. Concepts that appeared in Hellenistic texts often mirrored Babylonian techniques. In some cases, they were direct borrowings. This didn't diminish Greek contributions, but it reframed them, not as the beginning of mathematical astronomy, but as a chapter in a much older and wider story. A story that began in the scribal schools of Babylon. The implications are profound. If calculus-like thinking emerged in the ancient Near East, then our timeline of intellectual history is incomplete. We've built our understanding of scientific progress around certain peaks, Greece, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, while ignoring the valleys in between and the civilizations that filled them with brilliance. These tablets are a reminder that knowledge doesn't always develop in a straight line. It can arise in different forms, in different places, and then vanish, waiting to be rediscovered in a crate or a museum or the dusty archive of a forgotten empire. The Babylonians didn't leave us a theory of everything, but they did leave something just as precious. Evidence that human curiosity, when paired with systematic thinking, can reach across millennia. They looked at the sky and didn't just wonder. They measured, they modeled, they predicted, and they wrote it all in clay, hoping someone might understand. In 1952, deep in the archives of a museum, a cache of ancient clay tablets was unearthed by archaeologists combing through a forgotten storeroom. Unlike many of the mythological or administrative texts common to Mesopotamian collections, these bore something unusual: complex descriptions of metallurgy. At first glance, they resembled recipes, but as researchers translated them, the truth emerged. These were technical manuals, detailed instructions for alloying metals, controlling furnace temperatures, and producing specialized materials, some of which modern metallurgists struggle to reproduce. One tablet outlined how to produce a high-carbon steel using methods nearly identical to those of medieval Damascus steel, considered one of the finest in history. Another described the impact of tin content on bronze hardness, recommending specific ratios for weapons versus tools. The level of detail was astonishing. These weren't guesswork instructions. They reflected deep empirical knowledge. This clashed head-on with modern theories of technological evolution. Conventional wisdom held that metallurgy developed gradually through centuries of trial and error. Ancient metalworkers, it was believed, didn't understand why their methods worked. They simply followed inherited routines. But these texts told another story, one of understanding, one of cause and effect. They explained how heating iron with carbon-rich materials transformed its properties. They described quenching techniques, cooling hot metal in water or oil, and how each method affected strength and brittleness. They even outlined procedures for purifying metals and separating alloys, requiring knowledge of chemical reactions previously thought impossible in the ancient world. For example, one tablet documented a multi-step process for creating a bronze alloy with specific characteristics for temple statuary, balancing strength with visual brilliance. Soa Timun, balancing. The instructions included notes on temperature ranges, timing, and material sourcing. Metallurgists who reconstructed the process in modern labs confirmed it worked. The implications were enormous. Not only did ancient metalworkers possess practical skill, they also had theoretical knowledge, enough to understand the science behind what they were doing. At first, academics resisted. Maybe the tablets were symbolic, or maybe the complex passages were metaphorical. Some argued the texts were speculative, never implemented. But when experimental archaeologists followed the instructions exactly, the results were undeniable. The ancient techniques functioned, and in some cases outperformed modern equivalents. Even more revealing was the structure of the texts. They read like instructional material, implying formal training. There were teaching sequences, example problems, even margin notes that may have come from students or apprentices. This was not simply craft, it was education. In fact, some tablets included troubleshooting sections. If the metal hardens too quickly, reduce heat and stir with bronze tongs. These weren't idle musings. They were part of a curriculum. This discovery reframed ancient metalwork as a science, rooted in observation, experimentation, and transmission of knowledge. The smiths weren't just artisans. They were engineers, chemists, and teachers. And this insight raises a haunting question. How much other ancient scientific knowledge have we misunderstood? How many skills, processes, and theories have been dismissed simply because they came in unfamiliar formats, on clay, in verse, through oral tradition, rather than in equations and printed journals? The metallurgy tablets remind us that science doesn't always wear a lab coat. Sometimes it wears a leather apron, stands beside a roaring furnace, and leaves its legacy etched in baked clay. A legacy lost, rediscovered, and finally recognized not as folklore, but as science, in its earliest form. In the late 1990s, linguists working through a newly excavated archive of ancient tablets encountered a strange puzzle. Texts written in an unknown language, bearing no resemblance to any established linguistic family. The grammar was unlike Sumerian, Akkadian, or any of their neighbors. It was a linguistic orphan. But what they soon discovered would challenge one of the foundational beliefs of modern language theory. The language, once deciphered, turned out to be not only sophisticated, it was structurally advanced in ways that defied the timeline of linguistic evolution. It had complex verb systems, conditional clauses, and the capacity to express abstract philosophical concepts. It contained fully formed grammatical moods like subjunctive and optative that modern linguistics believed took millennia to develop. For centuries, scholars believed that early languages were necessarily simple, that they evolved slowly from basic structures to more complex ones. But this language, spoken thousands of years ago, shattered that model. It was capable of expressing hypothetical futures, layered temporal relationships, and logical dependencies with clarity rivaling modern English or German. The texts weren't mere lists or transactional records. They were philosophical treatises, scientific notes, poetic reflections. The vocabulary was rich with terms for cognition, ethics, mathematics, and astronomy. This wasn't just a functional language, it was a tool for complex thought. What stunned researchers most was the discovery of embedded conditionals, nested grammatical structures that allowed speakers to express ideas like, if the sun had not risen, the crops would not have grown, and the people would not have eaten. Such layered logic was thought to be a product of modern language development. But here it was, in a language that predated classical Greece by over a millennium. At first, some scholars claimed the interpretation was flawed. that the texts must have borrowed from more recent languages, or that the complexity was being imposed by modern minds onto simpler structures. But more tablets emerged, more inscriptions confirmed the patterns. Independent teams reached the same conclusion. This was a complete, fully capable human language, as advanced in expression as any spoken today. This forced a seismic shift in linguistic theory. Language, it turns out, doesn't evolve from simple to complex. All known human languages, ancient or modern, appear to possess similar capacities for expressing nuance, abstraction, and logic. What changes is the surface, the words, the sound, the style. But the underlying architecture is ancient. This insight went deeper than grammar. It suggested something profound about human cognition. If this forgotten civilization could reason in hypotheticals, debate ethics, and analyze patterns in the stars, then the capacity for abstract thought has always been with us. One tablet even included a reflection on knowledge itself, a philosophical musing on how people understand truth. The text argued that perception is not always reality, and that wisdom comes from questioning one's assumptions. It was an ancient echo of ideas found in Plato, Descartes, and Kant. And so the language that had once been discarded as gibberish turned out to be a mirror reflecting not just a civilization, but the persistent brilliance of the human mind. It's easy to forget that every modern insight stands atop forgotten ones, that the languages we speak now are not inherently better, only different, and that intelligence, insight, and complexity have never belonged to the present alone. The tablets tell us what the people of this lost culture once said, but more importantly, they show us how they thought. And in doing so, they remind us the human mind, in every age, has always reached beyond what it could see, toward meaning, toward order, and toward understanding. It was 1837 when a team of archaeologists in Egypt uncovered a trove of ancient papyri buried deep within a temple complex. Among them were scrolls that didn't contain spells or hymns, but something far more unexpected: blueprints. These texts described detailed architectural and engineering instructions, calculations for load-bearing structures, measurements for angles and inclines, and techniques for moving massive stone blocks with mechanical advantage. They weren't poetic or symbolic. They were technical. Modern scholarship had long assumed that Egyptian monuments, especially the pyramids, were built primarily through brute labor and simple tools. Ramp theories, sleds, and ropes dominated the conversation. Sophisticated engineering, it was believed, came much later in history. But these papyri told another story. One document detailed the slope angle required to construct a stable ramp capable of hauling multi-ton blocks to elevated platforms. The math checked out. Another included geometric methods for confirming right angles across large distances, essential for keeping pyramid bases square. The method used was identical to the Pythagorean theorem long before Pythagoras was born. Even more astonishing was a scroll explaining the stress distribution across a stone ceiling. The engineer had calculated the thickness needed to prevent collapse, using principles modern structural engineers recognized as sound applications of mechanics. This wasn't guesswork. It was theory applied to practice. The papyri also described materials testing. In one case, engineers examined stone blocks for cracks using percussion, tapping them and listening for changes in tone. Another set of scrolls recorded the dimensions of quarried stone, creating an inventory for quality control and planning. What emerged from these documents was the image of a highly organized system. There were design teams, supervisors, planning committees. There was even evidence of training, problems laid out with worked solutions, likely used in educational settings. At first, many historians dismissed the texts as theoretical. Maybe these calculations weren't actually used. Perhaps they were copied from Greek sources or misunderstood, but engineers reading the scrolls saw something different. They saw precision, logic, and consistency, the hallmarks of applied engineering. One of the most remarkable texts outlined methods for determining center of gravity and counterweights, principles foundational to crane operation and object balancing. These principles weren't reinvented in the modern era, they were rediscovered. These papyri showed that ancient Egyptians didn't just move stone with muscle, they did so with mathematics, with foresight, with a deep understanding of geometry, physics, and material behavior. And this insight reframes the legacy of Egyptian architecture. It wasn't mystical or miraculous. It was rational. It was engineered. The monuments we marvel at today weren't the result of primitive ingenuity, but of structured knowledge passed down through generations. This raises a humbling truth. Many ancient achievements dismissed as impossible or mysterious are only puzzling because we underestimated the people behind them. We assumed trial and error where there was calculation. We saw sweat and stone, but ignored the mind behind the method. The engineering texts remind us that progress is not about what tools you hold, but how you think. And the minds that calculated load-bearing angles in a time before steel or concrete were thinking clearly, rigorously, and brilliantly. The pyramids have stood for thousands of years, but the knowledge that built them, the principles of stress, leverage, and geometry, were hidden until these scrolls surfaced. Now we can read what the builders once knew. They weren't just laborers under command. They were engineers, educated, skilled, intentional, and their work endures not just in stone, but in the mathematics they left behind. In 2012, a team of researchers finally completed the translation of a cuneiform tablet found decades earlier in the ruins of a Sumerian city. It was expected to be religious or administrative in nature. Instead, it turned out to be something else entirely, a detailed agricultural manual. This wasn't folk wisdom or seasonal advice. It was systematic, scientific knowledge about soil chemistry, irrigation design, crop rotation, and even selective breeding. It challenged everything we thought we knew about ancient farming. Modern narratives portray early agriculture as simple, primitive societies sowing and reaping with little understanding beyond trial and error. But this Sumerian text laid out a plan as sophisticated as any flora found in 19th century agronomy. One section explained how planting legumes between cereal crops restored soil nutrients. Another offered specific guidelines for rotating crops across multiple seasons to maintain fertility. This wasn't intuition, it was knowledge. Even more surprising was the discussion of irrigation. The manual detailed how to calculate optimal channel widths, manage flow rates, and distribute water across a grid of fields. When modern hydrologists analyzed these techniques, they found them sound, accurate applications of principles we assumed were discovered only recently. But the revelations didn't stop there. The manual described selective seed harvesting, collecting only the most productive plants to use for the next season, tracking results across years, and refining the stock. It was deliberate. It was experimental. It was early genetics, in practice, if not in name. Some historians initially dismissed the findings. Perhaps the knowledge was localized, or perhaps the terminology was misunderstood. But as more tablets emerged with similar agricultural content, it became clear ancient Mesopotamian farmers weren't just laborers. They were agricultural scientists. And like scientists, they recorded their findings, debated techniques, and passed their methods through formal education. The manual was structured like a textbook, broken into sections with step-by-step instructions and explanatory notes. It may have been used in schools that trained administrators or farm managers for temple-run agricultural estates. One passage even addressed how to deal with soil exhaustion, advising farmers to rest fields, plant nitrogen-fixing crops, and reintroduce organic matter to improve structure. These are techniques still taught in agricultural colleges today. All of this forces us to rethink what we consider modern knowledge. We often assume that scientific agriculture began with the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution. But this tablet, inscribed with wedge-shaped marks 4,000 years ago, proves otherwise. The Sumerians didn't use tractors or satellites, but they used observation, experimentation, and record-keeping. They learned what worked and taught it. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for sustainable food systems that supported some of the world's earliest cities. Their insight wasn't limited to the land. It extended to governance, economics, and environmental management. They understood how water, soil, and crops interacted, and they treated that understanding as a public good, worthy of preservation. What this agricultural manual reveals is more than just ancient technique. It reveals a mindset, a belief that nature could be understood, that knowledge could be improved, and that human hands, guided by careful thought, could shape the land for generations. In a world now grappling with food insecurity and environmental degradation, the rediscovery of such ancient wisdom is more than an academic curiosity. It's a reminder that sustainable knowledge has always existed. Sometimes, we just have to dig it back up. In 2007, tucked away in a university archive, a clay tablet from ancient Babylon was re-examined under better lighting and sharper imaging. What at first looked like a set of geometric diagrams revealed something far more profound: mathematical proofs. Formal, logical, structured. A millennium older than Euclid. This single artifact rewrote the origin story of mathematics. For generations, the birth of formal mathematical proof had been credited to the Greeks. Euclid's Elements stood as the cornerstone, defining the very idea of rigorous deduction. But here, in cuneiform pressed into clay, were step-by-step logical demonstrations. Theorems stated, assumptions laid out, conclusions drawn by necessity. Not example, not rule of thumb, but proof. The tablet contained geometric relationships involving areas, angles, and proportions. But unlike most ancient math, which leaned heavily on calculation for practical problems, these weren't about construction or taxation. They were abstract, general, universal. The layout was unmistakably formal. Statements were tested through logical progression. Previously proven results were cited. Each line built upon the last, constructing an argument that could not be denied. It wasn't just math. It was philosophy in numbers. At first, some historians argued the structure was being misread. Maybe the text was instructional rather than deductive. Maybe the seeming logic was coincidental. But as more tablets were translated, each reinforcing the pattern, it became impossible to ignore. Babylonian mathematicians were practicing formal proof over 1,000 years before the Greeks refined it. This discovery undermined the idea that theoretical thinking was a uniquely Greek contribution. It suggested that abstract reasoning had deeper roots, stretching into the heart of Mesopotamia, embedded in the scribal culture that trained generations of scholars. The implications went beyond mathematics. If Mesopotamian cultures had a tradition of proof, of abstraction, then what else had been overlooked? How many other disciplines, astronomy, medicine, or engineering, had foundations laid not in Athens, but in the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates? And why had this been forgotten? Part of the answer lies in how we value knowledge. Greek texts were copied, translated, and celebrated during the Renaissance. Babylonian clay tablets, they were buried, broken, and unread for millennia. Our historical narrative favored what survived, not necessarily what came first. But now, with this tablet in hand, that story must be revised. Mathematics didn't emerge from a single culture. It evolved through a dialogue across civilizations, each building on the insights of those who came before. The Greeks did not invent proof. They inherited it, formalized it, and passed it along. This revelation doesn't diminish Greek achievement. It deepens it. It situates it within a broader human tradition of reasoning, one that crosses borders and epochs. The Babylonian tablet is more than a curiosity. It is a cornerstone that had been missing from the foundation of mathematical history. And it reminds us of something timeless. The human drive to understand is universal. Whether carved in clay or written on parchment, the search for truth follows the same path, built step by step, with logic as its compass. When we reduce ancient people to mere calculators or record keepers, we strip them of their intellectual legacy. But this tablet proves otherwise. They were thinkers, builders of theory, keepers of knowledge. And perhaps in recognizing that, we finally begin to see the full architecture of our shared human understanding. Not as a Greek temple standing alone, but as a structure built on many foundations, reaching farther back than we ever imagined. In a dusty storeroom in Thebes, long forgotten among crates of broken pottery, a wooden box held a rolled papyrus that would challenge the entire timeline of medical specialization. It wasn't a spell book or a list of offerings, it was something far more modern, a curriculum. The ancient Egyptian scroll outlined medical training, case reviews, and treatment discussions. It even referenced peer consultations and teaching methods. In short, it described a medical school. For centuries, historians believed formal medical education began with Greek thinkers, Hippocrates, Galen, and their intellectual heirs. Before them, ancient healing was thought to be little more than priestly ritual and trial-and-error folk cures. But this papyrus, over 3,000 years old, shattered that notion. Within its fibers were descriptions of medical specialties, doctors who treated the heart, others who focused on the eyes, some who addressed internal organs. It detailed how students were apprenticed to master physicians, how they were taught to recognize symptoms, differentiate between diseases, and apply specific remedies. There were protocols for surgical intervention, wound care, infection control, and even mental health. What stunned researchers most was the systematic approach. Conditions were described with diagnostic precision. If the patient presents with swelling of the limb and heat at the joint, but no external wound, suspect internal inflammation. Apply cooling salve. Observe for 2 days. It wasn't superstition, it was clinical reasoning. There were also instructions on when not to intervene, when a condition was considered untreatable. These decisions weren't made out of fear or ignorance, but from accumulated medical experience. The physician was advised to comfort the patient, record the case, and learn from the outcome. Further into the scroll, training methods emerged: repetition, mentorship, and something akin to a residency program. Students followed their masters on patient visits, discussed outcomes, and debated approaches. Difficult cases were shared between practitioners for second opinions. There was even a segment emphasizing record-keeping to improve future care. These details forced historians to reevaluate their assumptions. Egyptian medicine wasn't simply a mix of magic and myth, it was empirical, organized, and disciplined. Of course, initial reactions were skeptical. Some scholars claimed the scroll had to be symbolic. Others argued that medical specialization was overstated, but the evidence continued to build. Other papyri surfaced with similar themes. A system came into view, not isolated brilliance, but an institution of knowledge. The Egyptians even had an early sense of hygiene. One passage described sterilizing instruments with fire and boiling water. Another mentioned hand-washing before and after attending to wounds. These practices would not become standard in the West until the 19th century. But perhaps the most human moment in the scroll came from a line written in the margin, "Do no harm if no remedy exists." It was an early echo of the Hippocratic Oath, written long before Hippocrates. This papyrus reminded the world that wisdom doesn't start in one place or follow a single path. Medicine, like all great human endeavors, was nurtured wherever people observed, experimented, and cared. The ancient Egyptian doctors saw their work not just as treatment, but as stewardship. They sought to ease suffering, extend life, and pass on their knowledge. Their tools may have been rudimentary, but their thinking was anything but. And in that forgotten scroll, The quiet voices of early physicians speak across the ages, not with incantations, but with insight. Their legacy isn't just in the wounds they healed, but in the structure they built, a structure that still supports medicine today. In the brittle clay of a ruined city near the Euphrates, a set of shattered tablets once dismissed as mere accounting records revealed something unexpected. As fragments were pieced together and translated, they unveiled not trade figures or tax rolls, but star charts. Not symbolic astrology, but astronomical logs of stunning mathematical sophistication. This wasn't a surprise to those familiar with Babylonian astronomy. But these particular tablets went further. They didn't just record what was seen, they predicted what would be seen, using calculations. The charts dated back more than 2,000 years and laid out planetary positions centuries into the future. When modern astronomers compared them to computer-generated models of the night sky, the accuracy was uncanny, sometimes within fractions of a degree. This would be impressive on its own. But what truly shocked scholars was the method. The Babylonians were using a technique to calculate how fast a planet's speed changed over time. They weren't simply noting cycles, they were analyzing velocity. And they did it without modern notation, algebra, or geometry. Their approach, using area under a curve to represent distance traveled over time, closely resembled a core idea in modern calculus. Only it appeared here, centuries before Newton and Leibniz formalized it. It was not the same system. There were no graphs, no integrals. But the conceptual framework, the understanding of continuous change and how to quantify it, was undeniably present. This discovery undermined a deeply held belief that advanced mathematics began in early modern Europe. The truth, it seemed, was more complex. The Babylonian tablets showed systematic observation over centuries. They cataloged star rises, eclipses, conjunctions, but more importantly, they used those observations to build models, mathematical ones. They predicted future positions, not through mysticism, but through method. Some critics insisted the resemblance to calculus was superficial, that the Babylonians lacked the theoretical depth to understand what they were doing. But as more tablets were translated, patterns emerged. Their techniques weren't isolated. They were repeatable, tested, and improved. This wasn't luck. It was science. One tablet showed a multi-step process, dividing a planetary arc into intervals, measuring time spent in each, calculating a changing rate. In essence, it was velocity derived from displacement over time. Modern students learn this in calculus class. Ancient scribes were working through it on clay. Perhaps most revealing was how this knowledge was treated. The tablets weren't personal notes. They were shared records. Many bore marks of being used in teaching. Lines were corrected, steps annotated. This was not secret priesthood knowledge. It was scholarly. The implications are profound. It means that ancient civilizations were not only recording nature, but building abstract models to explain it. And more than that, they were teaching those models, critiquing them, improving them. What was lost wasn't just a technique. It was a culture of inquiry. The collapse of Babylonian science came not from intellectual limits, but from political ones. War, empire shifts, and the eventual fading of the scribal tradition closed the door on this early scientific revolution. Europe would reopen it nearly 2,000 years later, believing itself the first to ask these questions. But the tablets say otherwise. They remind us that progress doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it circles back. Sometimes it forgets. And sometimes it buries brilliance in mud, waiting for a new generation to uncover what was already known. In these fragile, fire-hardened slabs, we find more than numbers. We find evidence that the human mind, when given time, focus, and purpose, can pierce the veil of the cosmos, even with nothing more than clay, stylus, and the night sky. The trail of these ancient texts ends not with a final answer, but with a question that lingers like a quiet echo across time. How much have we forgotten? Each of the texts we've explored, etched in clay, inked on papyrus, carved in wood, pulled back the curtain on a world far more complex than modern theory ever allowed. They didn't just challenge isolated facts. They shook the very foundations of how we understand history, science, and ourselves. They showed us doctors diagnosing disease with stunning accuracy before Hippocrates, mathematicians proving theorems before Euclid, astronomers modeling planetary motion centuries before the telescope, navigators crossing oceans without instruments, engineers calculating forces and angles with tools made of reeds and string. And behind each discovery was the same response: first denial, then resistance, and finally reluctant acceptance. Why is it so hard to believe that the ancient world was intellectually rich? That brilliance didn't begin with us? Perhaps it's comforting to think of progress as a straight line, always climbing, always improving. That we are the peak, the most advanced, the most enlightened. But history tells a different story. Progress stutters. Civilizations rise and fall. Libraries burn. Knowledge disappears. Sometimes the greatest ideas are born, forgotten, and then rediscovered under dust and ruin. That's what makes these ancient texts so powerful. They remind us that human intelligence, our capacity for reasoning, creating, understanding, has always been there. What changes isn't the mind, but the memory. And memory is fragile. These texts were never meant to survive millennia. They were practical, temporary, meant for students, craftsmen, traders, physicians. Yet they endured, not because they were revered, but because someone, somewhere, took the time to record them. And someone else chose not to throw them away. Now, centuries later, we read their words and see ourselves. A physician wondering if their treatment will help. A teacher showing a student how to measure. A mathematician struggling with a new concept. A sailor watching the stars, hoping to find home. The tools may change, the languages may shift, but the questions remain the same. In that way, these ancient voices are not distant, they are familiar. They speak in a language older than writing, the language of curiosity. So what does it mean, then, when we find proof that ancient people were more advanced than we assumed? It means we have to be humble. It means we have to let go of the idea that progress is ours alone to own. And it means we must look at our own time not as a final destination, but as part of an ongoing story, one with many authors, many forgotten chapters, and many more still waiting to be found. Perhaps the most important lesson these texts offer is not about medicine or math or navigation. It's about listening. Listening to those who came before, to voices pressed into clay and lost beneath the waves, to civilizations we thought we knew but never truly understood. Because if we can listen, truly listen, then maybe we'll stop asking, how did they know so much? And start asking, what else did they know that we've yet to remember? And maybe, just maybe, the next time we unearth a forgotten scroll or decipher a broken tablet, we won't be so quick to dismiss it. Maybe we'll greet it not with disbelief, but with awe. After all, these ancient texts didn't just survive history, they correct it.